In the early fog of Lexington's autumn, a luxury SUV rolled to a stop by the Elkhorn River. Inside, two sleeping twin boys lay in a wicker basket, drugged, discarded, and drifting toward death, their cries silenced before they were even spoken. But fate had already sent its answer. From the mist stepped a white Mustang, wild, nameless, and divine. She didn't gallop, she didn't scream. She simply walked into the freezing river and pulled life back from the current. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The morning fog clung to the horse pastures of Lexington like a second skin. Damp and motionless, it draped over the Elkhorn River and the acres of rolling bluegrass, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The trees along the river, mostly pin oaks, with their leaves curled like forgotten paper, stood as silent witnesses. There was no wind, no songbird, only the slow churn of water beneath the mist and the distant purr of an approaching engine. A black Range Rover glided down the dirt trail that wound through the forest, its tires cracking twigs and skimming over a soft bed of damp golden leaves. The vehicle was spotless, polished to a mirror shine, its tinted windows swallowing all reflections. Inside sat Donovan Cross, age 45, trim, sharply dressed, a face so well maintained it looked carved rather than aged. His jaw was squared and clean-shaven, his salt and pepper hair slicked back with precision. The navy blue tie he wore was the same shade as his fiancée's eyes, a political family's daughter. Everything about Donovan had purpose. Clean, intentional, controlled. But his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Donovan was not a man easily shaken. As the head of Cross Equine Holdings, one of Kentucky's top racing syndicates, he had forged a reputation as calculated, stoic, and utterly unshakable. But this morning, this act, was unlike any merger or investment. This was personal. And the trembling in his chest, he told himself, was not fear, it was necessity. Behind him in the back seat sat a large wicker basket draped with a pale gray blanket. Inside, two small boys lay side by side. Noah and Elias, twins, 4 years old, their faces identical in structure but split by personality. Noah had Cassidy's sleepy smile. Elias, with his heart condition, had always been quieter, more observant. The sedative Donovan had slipped into their juice that morning had worked. They hadn't stirred since. Donovan refused to look at them in the mirror. He had met their mother, Cassidy Ray, 5 years earlier at a charity gala hosted in an art museum. She had played violin, Mozart maybe, while he stood beside a governor, pretending to listen. But the moment her bow drew across the strings, the entire room disappeared. She was like a flicker of firelight, delicate, luminous, fragile. Cassidy had long auburn hair, wide brown eyes, and the disarming habit of laughing at things that weren't supposed to be funny. She had been raised by a grandmother who taught her to believe that music was a kind of prayer. Donovan had loved her, once. Or at least something close to it. But when she told him she was pregnant, he had vanished from her life as swiftly as he had appeared. There had been no place for that kind of story in his carefully curated world, a world where wealth partnered with legacy and love was a liability. He had arranged monthly deposits for a while, paid for silence, and then vanished into a new life. Now, with a wedding weeks away and eyes from every corner of the state watching his every move, the children, his children, had become a risk too volatile to bear. Worse, Elias's condition had worsened, a rare congenital defect. Surgery needed. Blood needed. His blood. Donovan's chest tightened as he parked near the edge of the Elkhorn, the river running slow and brown, winding like a secret through the trees. Fog still hugged the surface, thick and unmoving. He killed the engine and stepped out, leather shoes sinking slightly into the soft, wet soil. There was a kind of eerie quiet here. The kind of quiet that used to fill confession booths and empty hospital halls. He walked around to the back door, opened it, and paused. For a moment, just a moment, he allowed himself to see them. Noah's thumb had slipped from his mouth. Elias's tiny chest rose and fell, his breathing shallow. There were bruises on the boy's arm from his recent IV. The sight caught Donovan off guard. He clenched his jaw, lifted the basket. He carried it toward the river slowly, as if the weight had increased. Each step seemed to sink deeper into the earth, the leaves clinging to his polished shoes like accusations. When he reached the edge, he crouched, placing the basket on the gravel shore, just a few inches from the waterline. He stared, and for a moment, the perfect suit cracked. Noah's eyes fluttered open. Groggy, confused, he looked up at the man looming above him. Their eyes met. Something ancient flickered between them. Recognition without words. A quiet plea. Donovan's heart, long-armored, buckled. Cassidy had once stood in the rain outside his building, clutching a soaked letter in trembling hands. "They're yours," she'd whispered. "They need you." And he had turned away. Now, with the world muffled in fog, that moment clawed its way back. Donovan swallowed the rising tide in his throat. He reached down, adjusted the blanket around Elias's feet, then leaned. "Sorry," he whispered. His voice was so low it barely reached the river. Then he pushed the basket forward. The current caught it slowly at first, then faster. The wicker began to bob, and one of the boys gave a soft sigh in sleep. Donovan turned, walked back toward the SUV without looking back. His breath trembled in his chest. Each step away from the water echoed like a verdict. By the time the vehicle disappeared into the fog, the river had begun to claim its cargo. But fate, fickle, untamable, had not finished writing the story. From the dense woods across the river, a shape emerged. A white Mustang, mare-shaped and moon-colored, with a mane like winter wind. She stepped into the water with the calm of something ancient, something that did not ask permission from man or nature. Her name, though no one had given it, was already whispered among the trees, and she had seen everything. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the world soaked and silent. The muddy trails that laced the Elkhorn woods were glistening with cold dew, and the fog hung lower than before, pressing down like a woolen blanket. Rainwater dripped steadily from the oak branches, creating a slow, rhythmic tapping that echoed through the trees. The sky was still the color of faded ash, pale and uncertain, as if the sun had not yet decided to rise. Juniper Alden, known to most as June, was already awake. She had been for hours. At 54, June moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long made peace with solitude. Tall and raw-boned, with sun-browned skin and iron-gray hair usually pulled into a low knot, she dressed in faded flannel and work jeans even on Sundays. Her face, though marked by crow's feet and a few scars of time, was sharply intelligent, set with eyes the color of creekstone. There was a quiet strength to her presence, one earned by both heartbreak and healing. She lived alone on the western edge of the Elkhorn woods in a weather-worn farmhouse that had once belonged to her father, a war medic turned rancher. June had inherited more than the property. She had inherited his steady hands and his stubborn silence. For most of her adult life, she had served as a veterinarian, once at a bustling clinic in Lexington, now only for the creatures who wandered close enough to find her. Retirement, if you could call it that, was a quiet rhythm of chores, reading, and the occasional emergency call from neighbors. On this morning, however, she wasn't expecting visitors. She had just stepped outside to unhook the henhouse latch when she heard it. A sharp, clear whinny slicing through the fog, not from any of her horses. This sound had something ancient in it, urgent, wild. She stood frozen for a moment, heart suddenly alert. Then she moved, fast. Her boots squelched in the mud as she crossed the paddock and past the barn. The sound came again, this time closer to the river. Instinct led her beyond the pasture, through the break in the woods where an old trail wound down to the riverbank. What she found there would haunt her for the rest of her life. Standing knee-deep in the shallows was a white Mustang, drenched and trembling, teeth gripping the handle of a sagging wicker basket. His coat, once silver-gray, now plastered in muddy streaks, shimmered with effort as he dragged the basket from the water. His eyes, wide, glass-dark, flicked to June only briefly before returning to the task. "Asher," she breathed. The horse was a ghost and a legend in these parts. No one claimed to own him, yet everyone had seen him. He was taller than most Mustangs, lean but powerful, with a white blaze like a comet down his face and hooves the color of cold stone. June had spotted him once before, nearly 6 years ago, during a blizzard when he had led her to a neighbor's stranded filly. Since then, she had kept a loose watch for him, occasionally leaving oats at the tree line. He never took them. Now here he was. And he wasn't alone. The basket gave a final lurch onto shore, and June rushed forward. Inside were 2 children, twins, boys, no older than 4. They were soaked to the bone, lips pale, faces bluish and still. One lay utterly limp, the other shivering weakly, Her hands moved before her mind caught up. She dropped to her knees, pulling the nearest boy into her arms. His skin was icy. She checked his pulse, shallow. The second boy, barely breathing. "I need heat. I need towels. I need God to help me now," she muttered. She glanced up. Asher was standing just behind her, not moving, steam rising faintly from his nostrils. There was no fear in his eyes, only knowing. June stood, heart hammering, and carried both boys toward the farmhouse. Asher followed, step by step. Inside, June worked swiftly. She laid the boys on the padded bench beneath the parlor window, peeled off their soaked clothes, and wrapped them in fleece-lined saddle blankets. She started a fire in the cast-iron stove with trembling fingers, then fetched her old vet's bag, still stocked with supplies she never imagined using on human children. The smaller twin, Elias, as she would later learn, was slipping fast. June began CPR, muttering encouragements through gritted teeth. "You're not dying, not in my house, not today." Her voice cracked with the weight of something she hadn't let herself feel in years. The memories surged up. A delivery room, fluorescent lights, a heartbeat monitor flatlining. Twice, June had carried life inside her. Twice, she had buried it. After the second loss, 8 months into the pregnancy, she had stopped believing in second chances. Her husband left a year later. She stayed. But now this. These boys. This horse. This moment. Elias coughed, a weak, wet sound, and June gasped, lifting him to her shoulder. He whimpered. His brother stirred next, eyes fluttering open, dazed and disoriented. June kissed both their foreheads. "You're safe. You're home." She didn't ask why or how. Not yet. Hours passed in soft silence. June never left the boys' side. She spoon-fed them warm broth, wrapped them in dry pajamas pulled from storage, and sang to them, a lullaby she barely remembered learning. Outside, Asher stood unmoving beneath the boys' bedroom window. His ears flicked occasionally, but he did not wander. Not even when the sun broke faintly through the fog. That night, June made a bed for the twins in the guest room, a space untouched for years. She pulled out a carved wooden horse from the top closet shelf, a gift she had meant to give her own son, and set it beside the lamp. She sat in the rocking chair by their side, watching their chests rise and fall. When she finally stood to leave, she paused at the window. Asher remained there, bathed in moonlight, motionless, watching. She whispered through the glass, "I don't know who sent you, but thank you." Then she turned back toward the boys and made a silent promise she would keep them alive. She would keep them hidden, and she would find out the truth. The frost came early that year, whispering across the hills of western Lexington with a chill that settled deep in the soil. The maples had turned brittle red, and the last of the goldenrod shivered under the weight of morning dew. At Juniper Alden's small farmhouse, mist rolled off the fields and gathered around the porch like it had questions no one wanted to answer. Inside, June poured black coffee into a clay mug, the steam curling around her sharp cheekbones. Her long gray braid was tucked behind one ear, and a flannel shawl hung over her narrow shoulders. The boys were still asleep upstairs, and Asher had taken position beneath their window again, unmoving as the new day broke. On the kitchen table sat the basket. Cleaned now, dried beside the fire, it still smelled faintly of river water and old panic. Nestled in its base, wrapped in the folds of a damp wool lining, was a small silver emblem, a brooch, or perhaps a pendant. It was no bigger than a quarter, round and delicately engraved. The design showed a flaming bowstring, mid-draw, with a sharp, stylized crest etched beneath it. The silver had tarnished slightly, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. It was the kind of thing that didn't come from any store in town. June turned it over in her palm for the 100th time that morning. She needed answers, and there was only one person she trusted to help her find them. Sawyer Alden arrived just before noon in a muddy pickup that growled up the gravel road like an old dog. He was 51, 3 years younger than June, stockier in build, with the same slate-gray eyes and no-nonsense demeanor. Once, Sawyer had been an investigative journalist in Chicago, sharp, relentless, and fearless. But after a failed story nearly got him killed in a firebombed warehouse, he left the city behind and returned to Kentucky, trading deadlines for soybean rows. He wore a tan canvas coat and boots caked in dirt, and he carried the same notepad he'd used for decades. It was leather-bound, creased and scratched, filled with half-legible scribbles and questions that never died. "You said it couldn't wait," he said as he stepped into the kitchen, taking off his cap. June slid the emblem across the table. Sawyer's eyes narrowed. He picked it up, studied it under the hanging lamp, then whistled through his teeth. "Well, I'll be damned. You recognize it?" "Not exactly, but I've seen that symbol before. Don't ask me where just yet. It's deep in memory somewhere." He pulled his notepad close. "Start from the beginning." June told him everything. The river, the boys, Asher, the condition of the children when she found them, the look on the youngest boy's face when he opened his eyes for the first time and clung to her sleeve like a drowning man. Sawyer didn't interrupt once. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "That's not just some pendant. This is a crest, family symbol. Could be old money." He tapped his pen on the notepad. "I'll bet you anything it belongs to the Crosses." June frowned. "Horse syndicate people?" Sawyer nodded. "Cross Equine Holdings. Donovan Cross. Richer than dirt and twice as slippery. Built his empire on land, auctions, and private deals. Very particular about his public image. No wife, no children. But rumor once had it he was tangled up with a violinist. Quiet scandal. Went away fast." June's eyes sharpened. "What happened to her?" "No one knows. Cassidy Ray, I think her name was, played at those big charity events, then vanished. Some said she moved away. Others said she went mad." He paused, looked at the ceiling. "You don't think?" June didn't need to respond. The thought was already loud in the room. Sawyer reached into his coat and pulled out a manila envelope. "Let's check the farmers market this weekend. Old-timers down there know every rumor that's passed through town since the Civil War. If someone's seen this emblem before, we'll find out." 2 mornings later, they arrived at the Lexington Autumn Market, nestled beside the county fairgrounds, where vendors lined up with baskets of gourds and jams, crates of antiques, and shelves of handmade soap. The scent of fried apples and sawdust floated in the air. Music from a fiddle band drifted between stalls. It was a world away from corporate boardrooms, and exactly the kind of place that remembered what the internet forgot. June held a folded scarf over her head to avoid attention, and Sawyer led the way, stopping at every stall that looked like it had dust older than him. They received plenty of polite shrugs, a few long glances. Then, at the corner near a table stacked with leather-bound hymnals and yellowed sheet music, they met him. The bookseller was in his 70s, stooped, with a long gray beard and deep-set eyes. His name was Clay Dorsey. He wore a wool cap and smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. Sawyer offered the emblem. "Ever seen this before, Mr. Dorsey?" Clay's hand trembled slightly as he took it. He stared long and hard before murmuring, Yes, I have." June leaned in. "Where?" He looked up at her. "There was a girl. Used to come play piano in the back of the Willow Brew Cafe. Cassidy Ray. Sweet thing, always wore a chain around her neck, silver with this symbol. Came in every Sunday, rain or shine, for months." "What happened to her?" June asked. "She stopped showing up, no goodbye. But the last time I saw her, she was expecting, maybe 6, 7 months. Sat at the piano, barely touched the keys. Just looked out the window like she knew time was running out. I remember her whispering something, 'They'll take them from me if they know.' Then she left." Sawyer scribbled quickly in his pad. "Where'd she live?" "Some said Rose Hollow, that old Cross family estate. It's half falling apart, but it's still theirs. Nobody goes near it." They thanked Clay and stepped back into the noise of the market. Sawyer was quiet until they reached the truck. Then he muttered, "June, I think those boys are Cassidy's. And I think that son of a Donovan, he's cleaning up the past." They climbed into the cab. Neither said anything for several miles. But the silence wasn't empty, it was strategy. A cold wind howled across the hills as dusk fell over Fayette County. The sky had darkened prematurely, painted with bruised clouds that threatened rain. Along the winding ridge road that connected the Elkhorn Woods to downtown Lexington, an old Dodge Ram moved with cautious urgency. Inside, tension hummed louder than the radio. Rebecca Cross sat in the front passenger seat, her gloved hands folded over a file embossed with the seal of the University of Kentucky. A woman in her early 40s with quiet grace, she carried herself like someone who had known both privilege and personal loss. Her ash-brown hair was tied back in a low bun, strands streaked silver where time had touched her early. She wore a long wool coat, deep navy, and beneath it her professor's cardigan and slacks. Her face, soft-featured and thoughtful, was pale from the gravity of what she had learned just hours before. Rebecca had once been close to Cassidy Ray. The young violinist had taken her class in romantic compositions and left a lasting impression not because of her talent, though that was formidable, but because of her warmth. Cassidy had laughed with abandon, asked thoughtful questions, and often stayed after lectures to discuss life, not grades. Rebecca had loved her like a sister. When Cassidy vanished, no one told Rebecca why. Her brother Donovan claimed she had moved north, that she'd grown unstable. And Rebecca, who trusted her family too much and herself too little, had believed it. Until today. In the back seat, June and Sawyer Alden sat silent, bracing against every bump in the road. June kept her eyes on the folder Rebecca carried, a collection of Cassidy's handwritten letters, medical records, a will naming her unborn twins as heirs to Rose Hollow, and most damning of all, a signed property transfer from Donovan's own grandmother to Cassidy Ray. Sawyer held the only copy of the Silver Crest pendant, wrapped tightly in cloth. The truck slowed as they neared the Rose Hollow estate. The trees grew denser here, ancient and unyielding, branches heavy with rain and history. The road narrowed, and headlights caught the decayed gate of the Cross family's once grand home. Moss clung to the stone arch like skin to bone, but they never made it to the gate. From the shadows of the trees, two men stepped forward, rifles in hand, dressed in plain outdoor gear. Their stance was relaxed, but the barrels were not. The taller one wore a ball cap low over his brow, and his face was clean-shaven, angular, unreadable. The other, with a faint scar down his cheek, had the unmistakable eyes of someone who had spent time in war zones, not cornfields. June instinctively reached for the door handle, but Sawyer grabbed her wrist. Rebecca's voice was sharp and controlled. "They're not local. Private," Sawyer muttered. "Donovan's kind of cleanup crew." The taller man raised a gloved hand. "Evening. Road's washed out up ahead, you'll need to turn around." Rebecca narrowed her eyes. "You're blocking private property." The man smiled faintly. "Just a precaution. Storm's coming." Before another word could be spoken, the underbrush behind the truck exploded with movement. Another figure emerged, blocking their rear exit. His coat was military green, boots silent in the wet leaves. His hand hovered near his waist. "We need to move," June hissed. "Now." But movement came from another direction. A streak of white, fluid, sudden shot through the trees behind the rifleman. Asher. He moved like lightning, mane soaked, eyes burning. He didn't hesitate. He didn't snort. He simply charged. The scarred man raised his rifle, but before he could aim, Asher barreled into him with crushing force. The man screamed, tumbled backward, rifle lost in the leaves. The taller man turned just as Rebecca lunged from the truck, slamming the door into his knees. He stumbled. But the third man, behind the truck, was ready. He raised his weapon, aimed directly at the group clustered near the front, at the twins who were just beginning to stir beneath a blanket in June's arms. Then Elias cried out. In a heartbeat, Asher twisted mid-stride and threw himself between the muzzle and the boy. The gunshot cracked like thunder. Asher's body jerked mid-air, and he crashed to the ground with a sound that would live in their bones forever. Silence. And then, "No!" June screamed. Sawyer tackled the nearest man, fists swinging like a man half his age. Rebecca dove toward Asher, hands shaking, knees collapsing into the mud. The mare's breathing was shallow. Blood poured from his chest, dark and warm against the wet leaves. Elias, in June's arms, reached out with a trembling hand, touching Asher's nose. Asher's ears flicked once. His breath sighed into the air, and he went still. Rain began to fall, soft, persistent, unrelenting. The attackers, disoriented, began to flee. One stumbled, wounded. The others vanished into the forest, swallowed by the storm. Sawyer's fists were raw. Rebecca's hands were stained. June stood, clutching the twins to her chest, tears mixing with the rain. There was no time to bury, no time to mourn. They gathered what they could, files, children, and disappeared into the woods. Behind them, Asher lay curled as if resting, the falling rain rinsing away the crimson that marked his sacrifice. Hours later, deep within the forest, they made camp in a hollow beneath the cliffs. There, under a lean-to of pine branches, they whispered prayers and promises. Rebecca held Elias close, her cheek pressed to his damp hair. "You were worth dying for," she murmured. No one slept. The storm raged above, but inside that small hollow, hearts beat on, beaten, bruised, but unbroken. Morning in downtown Lexington broke with a stillness that felt rehearsed. The courthouse loomed above the Clark Fork district like an ancient conductor preparing to raise his baton. Clouds slid across the pale sky like stage curtains, and the bare branches of oaks stood rigid outside the Fayette County Courthouse, their limbs etched black against gray stone. Inside courtroom 4B, the air buzzed with quiet tension. At the long mahogany bench sat Judge Miriam Kincaid, a woman of late 60s with sharp gray eyes and a voice that could still command a jury room like an orchestra. She was tall, with silver hair swept into a bun, and wore her black robe like a seasoned general's uniform. Kincaid had seen decades of corruption cases, land feuds, and broken custody battles, but none quite like the one on today's docket. Rebecca Cross stood at the petitioner's table, composed and unshakable. Her navy suit was pressed, and a lavender ribbon marked the thick file laid before her. She spoke not as a grieving sister, but as a witness bearing the last will of a woman long denied her voice. Beside her sat June and Sawyer Alden, their eyes locked forward, holding hands with Elias and Noah, who now wore matching gray sweaters and held soft cloth horses. Rebecca had sewn the night before. Gabriel, formerly Elias, sat quietly, his gaze fixed not on the judge but on the ceiling's carved molding. A music student would have recognized the rhythm in his eyes, as if counting measures between invisible notes. His twin Noah fidgeted with a broken violin string tied around his wrist like a promise. Rebecca began with the basics. Cassidy Ray's disappearance, her pregnancy, the relationship with Donovan Cross, now publicly known. Then she moved into the evidence. First, a notarized copy of Cassidy's handwritten will, naming her sons as the legal heirs to Rose Hollow. Second, an official property transfer deed from the matriarch of the Cross family, signed and sealed, granting Cassidy full rights to the estate. Third, a recording, one that silenced the room. It began with static, then Cassidy's voice, faint, raspy, but unmistakable. "If I don't survive childbirth, please protect my sons. Don't let him erase them. Music will lead them home." Rebecca's voice caught slightly, but she continued. Cassidy didn't leave in shame, she died in silence. Her children were thrown away not for lack of love, but because they stood in the way of power. Across the room, Donovan Cross sat in a gray suit, thinner than in news photos, wrists clasped gently together. The lights made him look washed out. Hollow. A faint tremor ran through his jaw when Cassidy's voice played. His attorney sat stiffly beside him, but offered no rebuttal. The final exhibit was a composition, The White Mare's Waltz, written in Cassidy's own hand. The piece was incomplete, with a final measure simply marked, "To be finished when my children learn to dance." Judge Kincaid lowered her reading glasses. "Has it been finished?" Rebecca nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Last night." Kincaid leaned back, her fingers steepled. "Then I'd like to hear it." That night, beneath the soft glow of string lights draped across the community hall, Lexington gathered not to judge, but to listen. The recital stage was modest, just a polished baby grand piano set before rows of folding chairs, bouquets of baby's breath tied to the aisle ends. Sarah Emerson, a tall, willowy woman with hazel eyes and a serene presence, sat in the second row beside June. A pediatric nurse who had volunteered to help with the boy's medical needs, Sarah had a history of her own. A brother lost to a rare disease she could never forget. Her quiet kindness had made her a favorite among the children at the foundation. Tonight, she held a camera in her lap, but couldn't bring herself to press record. Some moments, she believed, were meant only to be lived. Rebecca introduced the piece. "This is the completed waltz of Cassidy Ray. It was written for her children. Tonight, they give it back to her." Gabriel and Noah stepped onto the stage together. Gabriel took the piano bench. Noah stood beside him with a soft shaker in hand, more symbolic than musical. The crowd quieted. A single note rang out, then another, weaving a gentle melody that felt like a lullaby carried by wind. As the waltz reached its midpoint, the notes climbed higher, delicate, sure. Then Gabriel paused. A third voice joined the song. No visible player. No footfall. Just a harmony, soft, aching, and absolutely clear. Gasps whispered through the room. Rebecca turned sharply toward the piano's frame but saw only keys untouched. Sarah's mouth dropped open. Even Judge Kincaid, seated in the back row, leaned forward in disbelief. The chords shimmered. Above the piano hung a framed photograph of Cassidy Ray, smiling, violin tucked beneath her chin, and beside her Asher, the white Mustang, his mane blown back like the wind had whispered to him. As the final measure bloomed, a clean, luminous E major, the lights dimmed slightly. Then a single beam of moonlight, slanting improbably through the upper skylight, landed directly on the photograph, and from somewhere unseen, a single white petal drifted down. It landed on the music sheet between Gabriel and Noah. Gabriel smiled softly. Noah whispered, "Asher." The audience didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, with the last note echoing, the crowd erupted into applause. Not the polite kind, but thunderous, teary, full-hearted clapping from a community that knew it had just seen something sacred. Backstage, Rebecca wiped her eyes and turned to Judge Kincaid. "I believe the evidence now speaks for itself." Kincaid, eyes shimmering, replied quietly, "And for them." By morning, the court order was signed. Rebecca was declared legal guardian. June was granted permanent residency at Rose Hollow, and both boys were named rightful heirs of Cassidy Ray. Donovan Cross, after reviewing the files in silence, requested transfer to Pine Rest Recovery Center in Idaho. He left without resisting, carrying nothing but a thin envelope addressed to the ones I tried to forget. The twins returned to Rose Hollow that evening under a pale white moon. Sarah tucked them into the bed once shared by their mother. Rebecca placed the sheet music, now complete, on the upright piano in the front parlor. A candle burned beside it. Outside the window, wind stirred the old oak tree, and though no hooves marked the ground, they all felt him there. In a world that often hides truth behind power and silence, this story reminds us that love, real, sacrificial, and unspoken, can still light the way. Whether it's the courage of a guardian, the innocence of a child, or the devotion of a horse who gave everything, the message is clear. No one is ever truly forgotten when love speaks louder than fear. Just like in life, we all carry unfinished songs inside us, regrets, hopes, memories. But when we choose to protect the vulnerable, to stand up for what is right, even when it's hard, we help finish someone else's melody. We become part of their waltz. So let this story stir something in you. If it moved your heart even a little, take a moment, share it with someone who still believes in quiet miracles. Comment your favorite moment or the lesson that stayed with you. And if you want more stories like this, stories that whisper hope and hum with courage, subscribe to our channel. Your support helps the music go on.